In this video, we'll take a look at creating a watercolor sketch and create a painting of a bird. The first thing we'll do is we'll begin by drawing the basic shapes of the bird. I'm using an HB pencil here, and I'm drawing very loosely. I may make several lines as I try to find the shape of the bird. We'll be working on 140-pound Arches cold press watercolor paper. As I'm drawing out the basic shapes, I'm just looking at areas of contrast in value. I'm not worried too much with the details, as we'll develop most of the details with the watercolor. I'm looking at relationships between areas of positive and negative space to ensure that I get the correct shapes on the surface. It's always okay if your drawing is not completely the same as your reference, whether that be a live reference or a photo reference. We'll add a couple of lines here to give an indication of a branch in which the bird is resting upon. Now, with a kneaded eraser, I'll gently lift some of the lines that I've created. And now I'll go back in and create a few indications of some of the details. Again, we're not going to get too concerned with all of the details, just an indication of where these things are. For example, we're drawing the eye and locating some of the highlights. I'll also refine the shape of the bird a bit. Before painting, we'll revisit with a kneaded eraser, cleaning up some of the edges and lines a bit further. Now we're ready to begin painting. We'll start with a mixture of cadmium red pale hue and cadmium yellow hue. We'll apply a light application to the breast of the bird. It should be noted that I'm using Cotman watercolor paints, and I'm using the tube version of the paint. Different manufacturers' paints will behave differently, and of course different colors are available. Now, with a very light application of cadmium yellow hue, we'll go back and slightly alter the color. With watercolor painting, we'll start with light applications. We'll progressively get darker with our applications, meaning the values and the intensities of the colors will become stronger as we progress through the painting. We'll continue applying various mixtures of the cadmium yellow hue and the cadmium red pale hue. With each layer that we add, we'll progressively allow more concentration of the paint in the mixture. While I find myself using both cake watercolors and tube watercolors, I've found that for more intense colors, tube watercolor paints do have an advantage. The artist has the ability to mix more of the paint, the actual pigment, with the water in various concentrations, so you can create light applications if you like, but creating those intense colors with watercolor is a bit easier with the tube paints. Now we'll go back while the surface is still wet and just dab a little bit of a stronger intensity of our orange mixture. Because the surface is still wet, some of the color will bleed and move around, creating interesting effects. It should be also noted that watercolor paint is a medium that is completely unique, creating effects on the surface that cannot be achieved using other media. When painting with watercolor, we should take full advantage of these characteristics. Oftentimes, this means allowing the paint to move around the surface with less control by the artist. Part of success with watercolor painting, it requires a bit of confidence in allowing these things to happen on your paper. Of course, we still can achieve a level of control with watercolor, but allowing the paint to move and allowing it to be fluid is especially important. At this point, we'll continue pushing some of the values underneath the rear wing, making them a bit darker. As we discussed earlier, we're progressively making the values darker and the colors more intense, but it should also be noted that we are allowing the white of the paper to do the work for the lighter values. Of course, the lighter values are the tints of the color. It's the relationship of the darker values and the lighter values that communicate the form and the subject that we see in the image. These relationships can also inform us about texture and the light within the scene. It's especially important to pay close attention to the applications that you make with the watercolor. You want to make sure that you don't make the values too dark too quickly. Although values can be lightened by adding water and lifting the color from the surface, it's difficult to do this in many situations. Therefore, we're taking a bit of care as we develop the values. We have been gradually adding just a bit of burnt umber to the orange to make it progressively darker. Now we'll move on to the bill and the eye portion of the bird. To make a darker value here, I've mixed a bit of burnt umber and Prussian blue. This creates a mixture that's very dark, almost black. Initially, this mixture is dominated by the burnt umber. Here again, we're taking care to leave areas of highlight. Next, we'll go into the eye, applying the same color. And again, we'll leave areas for the highlight. After all, these areas of intense white need to be preserved. The white of the paper will do the job for the highlights. We'll also define a bit of contrast around the eye as well. And although this is a fairly large brush, it's still capable of producing details. The brush I'm using here, by the way, is a golden edge brush made by Grumbacher. It is a synthetic nylon brush. I have found this brush to be one of my favorites for watercolor painting. With this darker value on the brush, we'll continue to increase some of the contrast on the head of the bird, defining some of the feathers. Now, with a mixture that's a bit more dominated with the Prussian blue, again this is Prussian blue and burnt umber, we'll revisit the bill. This will make the values a bit darker. You may notice that I'm not using black from the tube here. Manufactured black has the tendency to look unnatural. By mixing our own black with a dark blue and a dark brown, we create a more natural appearance for areas that appear black in the painting. We'll also apply this color again to the eye, taking care to preserve the areas of highlight. Again, with this darker value, we'll make a few touches to increase the contrast. And while we have this color on the brush, we'll create a few areas of shadow underneath the wing towards the end of the bird. Another advantage, of course, to mixing our own grays and blacks by mixing a dark blue and a dark brown is we have the ability to control the color temperature of the black or gray that we create. More of the burnt umber, the brown, we create a warmer gray or a warmer black. More of the blue, or Prussian blue in this case, we create a cooler black or a cooler gray. Now, since this area should not be completely white, we'll layer over the top of it a very light application of gamboge hue, which is a yellow. This will allow some of the grace that we created underneath to show through, creating a more natural looking shadow. We'll add a slightly more intense version of this color to the legs of the bird. Again, this is still a very light application. And in our scene, we want to create some very strong highlights that exist on either side of the legs of the bird. For this reason, we'll leave a little bit of space from the actual edge of the leg. These sections may not be clearly evident at this point in the painting, but when we add the background, they'll be very clear. We'll progressively darken up some of the values that exist on the legs. Again, we'll progressively get darker with our applications. Here, again, we're using our mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber to create a natural black to darken up some of the shadows. Now, you'll notice that sometimes sections of your painting become lighter as they dry. In this case, the bill and the eye have become a bit too light in value, so we'll go back and revisit these areas with another application of our dark mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. Now work can continue to the wings of the bird. We'll use a mixture of phthalo blue with just a touch of burnt umber. Here again, we'll start with a very light application, preserving areas of highlight. The blues found in the wing of the bird will contrast nicely with the oranges found on the breast of the bird. This contrast is created because blue and orange are complementary colors or opposites on the color wheel. When choosing subjects for painting, try to find elements that you can accentuate in your painting. For example, it may be a color scheme like we see here with complementary colors, or it could be other elements such as texture or principles such as repetition. By finding subjects with elements that can be enhanced, you greatly increase your chances of success in your final painting. Here we're continuing to work down the lower portion of the wing, and again I'm just looking at areas of contrast. I'm making strokes in the direction that are suggested by the subject. As you can tell, the upper portion of the wing has marks that differ from the lower portion of the wing. And although these marks are not exact copies from the subject, the texture that is communicated here is enough to show difference and just enough detail for the painting. We'll go back now and increase some of the areas of shadow underneath the wing. Again, we're using our dark mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. Initially, this application seems very dark, but remember, the watercolor paint will dry to a lighter value. We'll also apply some of these darker values to the wing itself. There are a few areas of strong contrast in the subject. Remember, the contrast in value will also communicate the texture within the scene. Not only that, but also the directional strokes that are made with the brush. Therefore, as we develop this texture, we're not only considering the relationship of the contrast in value, but also the directional strokes that are made. These clues are found, of course, on our subject. And while we might not need to match them exactly, we do need to get the overall feel of the marks that are made. It goes without saying then that the texture on the lower portion of the wing is different from the texture on the upper portion of the wing, so the marks are different in these areas. Colors and values are perceived relative to the colors and values that are around them. At this point in the painting, we have enough contrast from the wing of the bird and the breast of the bird to see that we need to revisit the breast and intensify some of the color a bit. Therefore, we'll revisit this section with our mixture of cadmium red pale hue and cadmium yellow hue. We'll also intensify a few areas of the cadmium yellow hue, using only the pure color. We'll also intensify some of the colors on the leg of the bird as well, again using cadmium yellow hue and cadmium red pale hue. Just as the color on the breast needed to be intensified, there's also a section that needs to be lightened. We'll lift a bit of color from this section by using a bit of water on the brush, scrubbing it into the surface, and then lifting with a paper towel. Next, we'll address some of the initial applications for the branch. We'll start with a mixture of burnt umber and gamboge hue. We'll create several applications to create an indication of texture. Then, while the surface is still heavily saturated, we'll revisit it with a heavy application of burnt umber. We'll allow the color to bleed and move around on the surface. We can pull the color while it's still wet on the surface, creating additional indications of texture. Now, with a bit of water, we'll scrub a few sections and lift with the paper towel. This creates an additional level of texture. Now, if we were to leave the background white, this application on the branch would probably suffice, but since we will be darkening the background, we'll revisit the branch in a moment. Now, with a smaller brush, we'll start to refine some of the darker values and details on the bird, starting with some of the shadows on the legs. We'll add a bit of our orange mixture, again cadmium red pale hue and cadmium yellow, and we'll also give a few indications of some of the feathers on the breast of the bird. We'll go back to the section of the eye and add a bit of yellow around the eye itself. And with a very light mixture of phthalo blue, we'll add a bit of depth to the bill of the bird. Now it's back to the branch. Here, with a bit of burnt umber mixed with Prussian blue, we'll start to create some of the darker values. As you can tell, this mixture is clearly dominated by the burnt umber. Now we'll start to address some of the background colors. Since we want to create the illusion that the bird is in a tree, we'll create a variety of different greens for the background. We'll allow the green to be varied. In some sections, yellow will be more dominant, and in other sections, blue will be more dominant. We're creating this initial green by mixing ultramarine and cadmium yellow hue. We'll pull this color all the way up to the bottom edge of the bird. And as we just mentioned, we'll be creating a variety of different greens for the background. Some of the greens will be heavily concentrated with yellow, while others will be heavily concentrated with blue. We'll allow each application to overlap the last. In the end, we want the leaves of the tree to be implied. This means that we're going to leave out any details and instead just add overlapping applications of color. In some of the sections, we'll apply large amounts of water and then apply various colors on top, allowing those colors to bleed. It's okay to allow some of the colors that we add in the background to become a bit intense. Of course, we don't want the values in this section to compete with the values of the bird, so we're careful to make sure that there's enough value contrast between the colors that we add in the background and the colors already applied in the bird. As these strokes are made, we'll pull the brush in various directions to help insinuate leaves in the background. And now with a bit of color in the background, we'll go back to the branch and darken it just a bit further. Now, we want to create the illusion that some light is coming in from behind the bird, filtering through the leaves. To do this, we'll scrub some of the areas around the edges of the bird and lift up the color. Doing this will create somewhat of a glowing effect around the edges of the bird. Of course, we won't do it all the way around the edge of the bird, just in certain sections. Again, we're just scrubbing the surface using the brush loaded with water and then lifting with a paper towel. Of course, using water alone does the job, but if you wanted a stronger effect, you could also use alcohol to lift the color. Of course, it will lift more of the color off the surface, creating a stronger effect. We'll revisit the bottom portion of the branch one last time, this time allowing more of the red to show through in the mixture. This will contrast the green background since red and green are complements. We'll refine a few of the details in the eye and the bill using the smaller brush with our darker mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. And now our watercolor sketch of a bird is complete. If you'd like to learn more about watercolor painting, why not check out the Watercolor Workshop? The Watercolor Workshop is a complete course designed for absolute beginners. In this course, we cover materials and tools, including specific brush types and surfaces. We take a look at multiple application techniques and color theory. We look at several different compositional strategies that you can apply to your own work. We take a look at painting loosely with watercolor, and we cover a variety of different subjects, including landscape painting, cityscape painting, and portrait painting. We also cover several derivatives of watercolor painting, including watercolor pencils, mixing media, and opaque watercolor, commonly referred to as gouache. Now, of course, everyone doesn't learn by just watching videos, so ebooks are included with each of the modules. There are over 4 hours of video instruction included, all encompassed in 19 modules that include 18 ebooks that you can download and use along with the videos. So if you're ready to learn more about watercolor painting and start painting with confidence, check out the Watercolor Workshop today.